Greetings. Welcome everybody. Thank you for staying with us through our webinar today. Dr. David Childs, I'm the Associate Professor of Social Studies and History at Northern Kentucky University. Today we're going to talk about classroom resources, a hidden curriculum classroom resources for teaching African American history. We're going to really engage in some meaningful discussion about ways that we can integrate it throughout our entire curriculum, and not as an afterthought, thinking about the work of James Banks. James Banks is a foremost scholar in multicultural education. He talks about various models of integrating multicultural education into the curriculum. The first model he talks about, really the first level, is the contributions approach, which is basically you are introducing African American history, as I said, as an afterthought. For example, in a first or second grade class, when Martin Luther King Day comes around, you might give students handouts, Dr. King, they work on, and it's not really serious effort put into it. And then he goes into other deeper models, the additive approach, the transformation approach, and then the community action approach. And that third one, transformation approach, you are intentional about integrating African American history throughout the entire curriculum. Even in math courses, you may have, for example, word problems where you are using historical figures, or you may use math to figure out the slave economy. You can really be intentional about integrating African American curriculum. So we're going to do along that lines, we're going to move forward. Now, let me say something about this particular image here. This is a pioneering sculptor, Augusta Savage. She's working on a piece here in the Harlem studio in 1938 that maybe have been somebody may have never heard of, because often, as I said, African American history is presented as something that's not important. One of the things I say to my students at Northern Kentucky University often is African American history is American history. It should not be an alternative. Native American history is American history. Women's history is American history. And the way it has been presented in our classrooms, even to this day, has been not taken very seriously. And our curriculum, and I'm going to say more about this later, has been primarily Eurocentric. Okay, next slide, thank you. A call for a serious study of Black history in K-12 schools. For too long, serious study of African American history and culture in public schools and universities has often been an afterthought. American history courses are normally not a part of required curriculum, but are often optional. When the topic is discussed in K-12 schools, it is often relegated to a lesson, a short lesson on slavery, or a mention of the civil rights movement. The curriculum is often missing the rich study of African American history and culture. Topics such as the knowledge and wealth of ancient African empires, the kingdoms of Ghana and Mali and Egypt, as well as the ancient Timbuktu library. In fact, people often look at the study of Egypt as a European a civilization, but actually it's in Africa. And so we must study seriously. Another topic, the Harlem Renaissance. We don't talk about Harlem Renaissance. Many people may not even know what that is. The history of African American music, rarely mentioned. With the recent rise of racial tension and blatant prejudice, the attack on the Capitol, and the rise of white supremacy and white supremacists like the Proud Boys, it is perfect that we deal with this information. And racism, the rise of racism in our society, it is time for educators on all levels to take the study of Black history and culture seriously. We see another image here. Our whole topic of study is African Americans in sports. Just a description of the image, the medalists in the long jump competition you see here, they salute from the victory stand at the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin on August 8th. From the left, you see Japan's Naoto Tajami, and then the bronze medalist. In the middle, you see the American Jesse Owens. The gold medalist set an Olympic record the event and offered an American-style salute with his hand to his forehead. And interestingly enough, on the right, on my right, you see Germany's Lutz Long. He's a silver medalist, giving a Nazi salute. And so that's an example of you could do an analysis of this particular image, and this goes beyond just what we normally study. Next slide. Although the topic of American slavery and the civil rights movement are of the utmost importance to study, educators can explore other topics in Black history and culture, including the history of African American education. And so I want to definitely give a shout out, by the way, to the educators that joined us. The overwhelming amount of support we received today across the tri-state area. I do want to say, as we go through this talk and even beyond, if you want to contact me, we can have conversations about curriculum planning and everything. I wanted to call to say that because we are here for the educators. This is what I like to do, talk about curriculum planning. But some things you might think about introducing into your class, because a lot of people say, well, I don't really know what approach to take. If you took the history of African American education alone, you could spend weeks, an entire semester doing it. It could be a class by itself. Hip hop history and culture is another topic outside of just slavery and civil rights. Now, I do want to say, again, it's the utmost important, probably one of the central topics for African American history, of course, is the impact of slavery, the impact of Jim Crow, the impact of discrimination, civil rights movement. But African American history should not be relegated to those topics. African American history before the U.S., in the African empires, the Harlem Renaissance, as I mentioned earlier, Black adventures. These are all topics you can introduce to your class, even at the elementary level. The history and role of the Black church, the Black intellectual tradition. That's something people don't know about. We often think of African Americans as backward and subservient, but there's a whole tradition of Black publishing that go back to the 1700s. Black intellectuals, people like W. Du Bois, the first Harvard graduate to get a PhD. And here you have an image to your right of Madam C.J. Walker, Sarah Breedlove, better known as Madam C.J. Walker. She drives her new car as the first woman to become a self-made millionaire in the United States. The first in 1911. You see the Smith collection. This is from the Smith collection, Getty Images. Next slide. Schools in the U.S. have not done a good job of presenting the full picture of American history. I argue that a lot of the racial tension and strife we have in our schools and in society, in the political perspective, is the fault of history teachers and schools not doing their job. They have presented history and social studies from a Eurocentric perspective. It is really important that we study folks like Abraham Lincoln. We study folks like George Washington. I'll give an anecdote in terms of the importance of these founding fathers. When I was in Washington, D.C., the church, St. John's Church, that's right across from the White House, the church where Donald Trump got in trouble holding the Bible, all the controversy around it. I was in that church a couple of years ago during the Obama administration. If you would go into that church, you'll see that they have seats that are designated to the president. And the historian that works in that church, she told me that Abraham Lincoln was a church-going man, and what he would do, sometimes he'd wake up and walk across the White House lawn and go and sit in the back of the church. And he would let the service get started. And once the service got started, he would slip into the back of the church, enjoy the sermon, enjoy the hymns. And then right before they closed the service out, he would he would leave before people noticed. He had a habit of doing that. So that's great American history that we should know. But that's not the only history. As I said, African American history is American history. It should not be a sub-topic. But we've been presented so often from the perspective that the only important folks are the so-called founding fathers. What about the founding mothers? What about history of women? They were there as well. And so I think we have much work to do, and I'm going to get into really some examples. I'll offer several examples of engaging ways elementary, middle grades, and secondary teachers can teach African American history aligned with social studies standards. There's a great emphasis today to have students do a deep dive using the inquiry model. Okay, next slide. Inquiry and teaching African American history. Inquiry is the shift from the studying of social studies to memorization. Often when we think about history and social studies, especially those that are more math people or science people who are into math, social studies was really a chore for you. And you often had to memorize dates. You often had to read the textbook aloud, the round robin approach. You often were expected to pay attention, because if you weren't paying attention, you would be caught not knowing where we were when you were called upon. And history, even in my own classes, I remember back in middle school, history was presented as packets. And not to insult anyone, maybe some of the teachers that are listening now, you are still into packets and worksheets. But of course, we all know there's much more we can do. That's where the inquiry model comes in. I know Dr. Swan and others a little bit later want to deal more into the inquiry model. I just wanted to give a nod to it and talk about it as it relates to my approach. The inquiry model learning provides the opportunity for students to put on the lenses of a historian, a geographer. The doing of history is what the new social studies call it, Jerome Bruner. The doing of history. You become a geographer, you become an economist, you become a political scientist to gain knowledge and deepen students' understanding of the past and the world today. It involves students asking questions and investigating, facilitated by the teacher. And so, rather than memorizing numerous factoids to regurgitate on the test, rather than memorizing the War of 1812 and every single sequence that happened, is more about students doing the investigation and using the constructivist model, where they create their own learning, they develop their own learning. So teachers might provide primary source documents, teachers might have students listen to music and look at lyrics. So we're going to get into some of that as well. Next slide, please. One of the struggles that many people may have, and when I talk to teachers, is how in the world do I integrate African American history, the teaching of African American history at the elementary level? And I'm going to give you some ideas here for you to think about. We are just scratching the surface, just know that. Often, as I mentioned James Banks earlier in his work with multicultural education, he would say that often it is an afterthought at the elementary level. As I said, a word find on Harriet Tubman or George Washington Carver, or watch a video about Dr. King, and that's it. But there's much more we can do. Next slide, please. To the right, I included a photo of George Washington Carver. This is from 1940. Now, we know George Washington Carver as the Peanut Man, and that is what he was famous for. But what most people don't realize, he was one of the early persons that would talk about sustainability and the importance of the environment and letting the soil give back. What he did work with poor Black farmers in Alabama and helped them. They were sharecroppers at that time, and they were really struggling economically. And so that's how he got into helping them develop different uses of the peanut. And the peanut was a very rich product, and it offered a lot of nutrients, and it was good for the soil. And so he was thinking about economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and he's not much known for that work. There's a topic there that teachers can really delve into. Now, interwoven throughout a U.S. history class, teachers can introduce students to important African American men and women in history. So let's get into some of these resources here. Next slide, please. And these are just, I use the social studies standards. I realize some folks may be in Ohio or Indiana, but these are just some social studies standards that State by Kentucky. Thank you. I got a note, okay? Appreciate that. A mental note, but these are some Kentucky standards here that will be very helpful to you to use. For example, one, use evidence to develop claims in response to compelling and supporting questions. That gets into the inquiry model, standard 5 IUE1. Next slide, please. Here's some objectives. So let's talk about a lesson you might try. I like to develop my objectives into 3 categories. You could really add another one, maybe like action objectives, but I borrow this from the work of Zarillo, and she wrote a book on social studies teaching and learning for elementary and middle grades. But the content objective, that's going to be the one that aligns with the standards. Students will learn about various important African American figures in U.S. history. But as we go deeper, value objectives, what do we want students to learn? What deeper concepts do we want them to learn? Students will learn history that goes beyond a curriculum that centers on European Americans. Okay? Again, it is not wrong we don't want to omit conversations about the founding fathers and the role of U.S. Grant in the Civil War, or Robert E. Lee, or those kinds of things. But it is intellectually dishonest to only focus on European American history. That is the problem with our curriculum. And that's why we're here today, to give you some meaningful ideas. Process objectives. Students will study various African American historical figures and engage in role play to learn more about them. The students that talked earlier, Sidney Locke and the others, begin to talk. In fact, Sidney Locke in particular from NKU, she talked about when she was in 1st and 2nd grade, this is something that they did. But that process objective, let's look at how we might do that. Next slide. A living museum. Okay, here's an idea. This is an assessment. Students will choose a notable Black pioneer they'd like to know more about, such as voting rights and women's rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer. Now, let me pause. That it may be a person you may have never heard of. That's an example of how much work we need to do with our students. The dancer, Alvin Ailey. You may have heard of the famous Alvin Ailey School in New York. Or they may want to act out Betty Reese Soskin, the oldest full-time National Parks Ranger. Wouldn't that be cool to have a student do that? Or a more familiar person like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Dr. King. Let me pause and say, most of our Black history in the United States centers around Dr. King, Martin Luther King. He is so, and we don't even really delve enough into what Dr. King was all about. We relegate the study of Dr. King to a speech. Of course, Martin Luther King Day to the end of his speech. A lot of people that cite Dr. King would not have liked him or agreed with him during the time. He was called a communist because he fought for economic justice. In his Poor People's Campaign, he fought for economic justice and for a living wage and to help people have a living, make a living. And he doesn't often get talked about in that way. And so there are so many different individuals. We talked about Madam C.J. Walker, that students can take on that role in a living museum. Then students will host a living museum in your classroom. Students can dress up and share what they learned through their research. Okay, that's one example. Next slide, please. As part of a larger geography and American history unit, the topic of slavery and Black cultural reforms can be woven throughout the unit. As I said, slavery is probably one of or the most important topic to talk about as it relates to African American history, because it still impacts us today. How? It impacts our education. We're still playing catch up in the Black community. It impacts us economically. How so? Because if you have an entire generation of European Americans that had wealth that come from the 17 and 1800s, you have an entire population of African Americans that weren't able to participate in the American dream until after the end of slavery in 1865 with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Then we're still playing catch up. And so slavery still impacts us today. But at the same time, as I said, what I want to do is give you some ideas of how to integrate topics throughout a unit on slavery and Black cultural forms. Here you see a painting. What I try to do is include images, non-traditional images as it relates to Black studies and African American history. And this is a painting called The Tree of Knowledge from Dion Pollard. And it's from the African American arts tradition. There's a whole topic. Can you imagine doing a lesson or a unit on the African American arts tradition and weaving all kinds of historical topics into that? The Harlem Renaissance, slavery, Jim Crow, music, culture, all these things you can integrate into conversations about Black arts, okay? Next slide, please. I'm just citing more standards here from Kentucky Social Studies. Let's go forward here one more time. Objectives, here's another idea that you might try. My content objectives for this one: students will learn the purpose and meaning of African American spirituals by analyzing song lyrics. Value objectives, what values, what are takeaways that students can gain and understand, if they can gain an understanding of the value, function, and purpose of African American spirituals to enslave people in the U.S. The purpose: steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus, steal away home, ain't got long to stay. That's an example of a spiritual, that's a well-known spiritual that you may or may not have heard. And you know, if you study any aspect of spirituals, they have a double meaning, that value objective there. So it was, of course, a religious expression, but also it was for comfort and communication, and also they often had hidden messages. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. And then often that was a signal that it was safe to go in the water. Don't you let nobody turn you around, turn you around, turn you around. Don't you let nobody turn you around. Keep on walking, keep on talking, walking up the freedom lane. And I wonder, we're sitting in a historic African American school right now here on South Bay Street. I wonder how many spirituals may have been sang here all those years ago when African American students, or colored students as they used to be called, that word has gone out of fashion. Did they share songs like that? I wonder when the last time a spiritual was sung here. But that's that value objective. And the last song I sang was actually from the Civil Rights Movement. So there are different kinds of spirituals. There are spirituals that were sung during slavery, and they carried over into the Civil Rights Movement. And singing became a really important part of the Civil Rights Movement with Mahalia Jackson, et cetera, and so forth. Then we get to the process objective. Students will listen to several examples of African American spirituals and also examine the lyrics. When I teach this, of course, I share music myself, but I know that everyone is not a musician. But nowadays we have YouTube, we have clips, we have the internet. But the important thing as it relates to inquiry that we're going to get into here is lyric analysis. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm going to see if these links work. Can you click on that first link here? And as he clicks on the links, I will give you an example. I sang the song Steal Away. And if they don't, we'll just move on. Okay. I sang the song Still Away. I wanted to show you this database. It actually pulled up. Thank you so much. This is called the Spirituals Database. And I believe we're going to make this PowerPoint available for the teachers that are listening. And I know some joined us last time. I wanted to show you this database. Need to scroll down a little bit. The Negro Spiritual from the cotton field to the concert hall. It gives a brief history here. Go down a little bit. And yeah, just keep going. And it deals with, and I believe that's the Fifth Jubilee Singers. Fifth Jubilee Singers were well known for popularizing the spirituals. They traveled the country in the 20th century sharing spirituals. I went out to Fisk last year. It's a historically black college that still exists. And actually, they have a lot of Dr. King's. They had Dr. King's robe and some of his artifacts there. You go down. You were doing. Thank you, right thing. Okay, keep going down. I just wanted to show you a little bit of this. And there's a way to search. If you go to the, that's good right there. And see, this is an example of a spiritual. And spirituals are organic, okay? And what you want to, as a teacher, what you want to understand is spirituals are organic. So sometimes they will take the same lyrics and impose them on another song. African American music is different from Eurocentric music because it's organic. It has various rhythms. And then there's some of the language. It gives you kind of a lexicon, I guess, to interpret maybe some of the words. Heaven. That way, when you're doing some primary source analysis, you can know that. Go down a little bit, please. Is that the bottom of it? Okay. Go to 4 down, the Negro Spiritual. Yeah, that's right there. Okay. That's not where I want to go. That's okay. Let's move forward in our slides. Let's just move forward. I wanted to show you that resource in the interest of time. And then I talked about Still Away. Go to the document analysis worksheet. Let's see if that pulls up the second one there. I shared this before in another webinar. Somebody remembers this. I wanted to show you this. This document analysis worksheet is for, if that link doesn't work, you might, okay, it's pulling up. It is a tool for teachers to use whereby you can analyze the meaning and background. You can have students become the historian. This is that inquiry model that we were talking about earlier. Students become the historian. They become the demographer. They become the social scientist. So look at category number 1. Okay, students can check what type of document. Is it a letter? Is it other? And then they can go down. See, they're doing the work. So rather than giving an hour lecture every class, students will have the ability to do a deeper dive and analyze some of the cultural forms as they relate to African American history. So now I'm not just memorizing the fact that Abraham Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. I'm just not memorizing that the first slaves came to Jamestown in 1619 as indentured servants. I'm not memorizing that, but we're going to do some more meaningful analysis here. And we're looking at the importance of the material because memorizing dates, understanding dates is important, but more important is those cultural forms and what happened at that particular time. Other resources I have here, I'm not going to go into all of them. Library of Congress has a collection of African American spirituals. There's a slave book, the original slave book, an image of that on that YouTube. If you can click on that last one, the Golden Gospels, Oh Freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, Oh, freedom over me. Before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go up into my Lord and be free. That's a YouTube clip. You can, that's okay. I sang it already. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. So that's an example. If you're doing this in class, I mean, there's countless spirituals you can grab from the internet. And so what I would do is have students analyze what the words mean, what it would mean for an African American, what it would mean for a European American, etc., and so forth. Next slide, please. Assessments here. Students will, so as it relates to the spiritual project, students will use the written document analysis worksheet to analyze African American spirituals. Number two, students will create their own spirituals using concepts gleaned from studying African American spirituals. As a side note, when I've done work around hip hop and poetry, I will have students create poetry, even sometimes haikus, related to their own life. Okay, when I've done work with urban students, I've had them write poetry and hip hop lyrics about some of the things they're going through, their struggles, the struggle with education. You can do the same thing with spirituals. Also, I love doing fishbowls. If you haven't used the fishbowl concept yet, in a nutshell, it's an alternative to a discussion or a debate. So let's take a debate. Let's say we're debating the election. Let's pick a hot topic. Let's say we're debating election fraud, voting fraud. Normally, traditionally, teachers will split the room down the middle, for or against, or maybe you would have a neutral side. But the fishbowl discussion will have designated students, maybe 6 or 7 students, that will sit in the middle, and all the rest of the class will surround those students. They will have a discussion about a particular topic. The students on the outside circle, it's like a concentric circle, they can't talk, okay? They can just listen. It's a listening exercise. But they're taking notes, and then once the students in the middle have discussed for 2 to 3 minutes, people can begin to tap in. And so somebody from the outer circle, they tap that person on the shoulder that's in the circle, they switch places. So now that new person that's outside can't talk. The person that came in can talk. That's fishbowl, okay? You can do a fishbowl discussion in this context surrounding understanding the purpose of spirituals for enslaved people in the past. What are cultural forms and artistic expressions that help people overcome oppression and racism in modern times? What role can art and music, for example, hip hop, play in challenging injustices in our time? So have a fishbowl debate about that. Those are some examples of assessment. Next slide, please. Other ideas and resources for teaching Black history to elementary students. Integrating African American authors into your curriculum. Can you click on that, please? This is from a project called Democracy in Me that you may have heard about out of Cincinnati Public Radio. Democracy in Me is designed to provide resources for the public and primarily teachers surrounding civics, surrounding history, American history, surrounding the topic of diversity and culture. Okay, go down to the bottom, please. What I've provided, you can access this. Well, that's good. Go back up a little bit where you see the books. What this is these are books by African American authors that you can access and use for your class. There's a growing number of them. This is a great way to integrate African American history into your curriculum. And notice that all the books are not about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman. But notice that you have various books here that teachers can use. And I always advocate build your classroom library. Build your classroom library. I'm going to, if you can click on the second to last book, Sisters Are Champions. This is a book about, look at that, Serena, the Williams sisters. What a great way to talk about African Americans in sports. Remember I talked about African American history doesn't only have to be about slavery and civil rights. This is a great example. You could build curriculum around this. Remember we talked about Jesse Owens in sports. You can talk about Michael Jordan, his accomplishments. You can talk about LeBron James. You can talk about all the contributions that African Americans have made. Jackie Robinson, that's the obvious one. Hank Aaron have made. You can do an entire unit around this. And here's a great book to use in that resource. Okay, go back, please. Let's look at one more book. Okay, the top of the list, click on that one, yes. Layla's Happiness, and it just really deals with African Americans as everyday people. Okay, they're not necessary, they're just people. They don't have to be relegated to history like we often do Native American history. Okay, we can go back to the slide presentation, please. Number 2, other resources and tools. Listening and reading. African American folktales and fables can enrich children's understanding of many cultures. Turn a story into a play in this activity from Arthur. There is a activity from CBS Cartoon Author about folktales. There's a resource there for Black folktale resources. In this activity, as I said, students can learn. There's a whole tradition that people may or may not know about African American folktales and fables. Fables that include animals like Brer Rabbit, that was a trickster, different animals that gave a moral story. There's a whole African American literary tradition around folktales and fables that's an untapped resource for teachers. In fact, there's a whole African American literature tradition. Earlier, Sidney Locke mentioned Phyllis Wheatley, the poet. But there's writers, David Walker, Bishop Daniel Payne from the 1800s, from the mid to late 1800s. Dr. King, most people don't realize he had copious things that he wrote. That's not even untapped. There's a whole literature tradition in hip hop, poets, urban poets. These individuals are not thugs and criminals. Many of them have college degrees, and they're writers and they're thinkers. So there's so much, like even what Childish Gambino is doing. Donald Glover is his name. He's an actor, thinker, writer. He does all kinds of stuff. A hip hop artist. And so this African American tradition is a hugely untapped resource. Who can forget Zora Neale Hurston? She's written plays and books. Teaching, there's another resource. We're talking about elementary. I was getting to middle school and high school there. But the fables can be really used well in elementary classes. And then thirdly, you might want to check this out. I'm not going to click on it in the interest of time, but teaching 6-year-olds about privilege and power. Go ahead and click on it because this is important. And I know there is a struggle on, okay, how am I going to teach 5 and 6-year-olds about racism? And some teachers will shy away from it because it's such a sensitive topic. Nobody wants to go there. But let me explain something to you. When I was a child in elementary school, I experienced racism. I'll give you one example of many. My brother and I were walking down the street. We were from the inner city neighborhood, but we were going to play basketball in a middle class neighborhood. And as we were walking down the street, a group of white teenagers drove up to us, got out of the car, and slapped us around and pushed us and scuffled us up. And I think I was maybe 10 and my little brother was 7. And that had a lasting impact on me. So why in the world would teachers say we cannot talk about racism because it's a sensitive topic when you have students in your classroom experiencing it every day? And then we're seeing the news. We're seeing the ugliness in the news. It is high time we begin to talk about power relationships. We begin to talk about poverty. We begin to talk about the African American experience. So thank you. So this whole, you may want to check that out. This is some great resources here. Can you go back to the top, please, really quickly, and then we'll move on. So it has a place you can listen, and but that's 6-year-olds. So it's for mind shift. That's 6-year-olds. So thank you. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. Oh, okay, we can keep going, because I want to hurry on because I want to get into some middle grade examples, and then I'll reserve time for questions. Classroom museum photo gallery. This is another example. Other ideas, tools, and resources. Students can create a museum photo gallery in the classroom with dates and descriptions under each photo, highlighting key events, people, and places from African American history and culture. You can do this with first and second graders. They can write on the level that they are at, okay? So, of course, first and second grade, they're just learning how to read. They're doing sight words. You can integrate vocabulary into your sight words and prepare for their in-class museum, okay? This could be a year-long project. You can tie in much of your curriculum, your math, your language arts, your science into this project, this culminating experience. Numbers thinking, that's how you can incorporate a map. How many people are in this image? Do you see groups of 2? Okay, how many dogs does he have? So that basic math there. Doesn't always have to be long division and multiplication, especially in that early grades. You're not going to get into that anyway. But examples of important figures. Example photographs and images from the Harlem Renaissance, hip hop culture, early television and film. You can integrate that into your museum. African American soldiers, the Black church, in contemporary times. All of these images can be found online and printed for free. Okay. Number 2, this is a resource I want you to check out on your own. This is a cartoon that PBS developed using the Arthur cartoon to address racism. There's also a brain pop that deals with Black Lives Matter. You want to check that out too. And example 3, K1 lesson on Martin Luther King's life and words associated with him. That's a really cool lesson that you might use. There's a PDF there that you can click on. But we're going to move forward. This is middle grade, 6 to 8 sample lesson ideas. Okay, I'll move forward here. As a part of an American history, and I forgot I have my clip. I haven't even tried it. As a part of an American history unit on the 1950s civil rights or 1960s, the topic of racial protest can be interwoven throughout the unit. Okay, so
for teachers K-12.
Yes. Teacher education programs, one of the critiques I have about teacher education programs across the country as it relates to training is the lack of training in teaching diverse populations and multicultural education. Largely, teacher education programs are designed to teach at middle class schools, suburban schools. And so what we have is well-meaning teacher candidates graduating and going into the field and working in places like Cincinnati Public or Newport Schools, or Covington Schools, Newport Schools, and schools in Louisville, in urban settings, or even rural diverse settings, and they're inadequately prepared. There is a great need for even curriculum like we're talking about today. Studying folks like the work of James Banks, looking at culturally relevant pedagogy. That is pedagogy that has to do with, that's not one size fits all, but that can address the needs of diverse populations. And being versed in that, there's a program I was a part of out at my university. It developed an urban cohort where they would do with urban funds where students would be part of their curriculum was to learn, teach and learn in diverse settings and go to community centers and be in the community and get comfortable with those people. Because often people come out of teacher education programs and they go to, my wife, she taught recently at Cincinnati Public, and they're inadequately prepared. They're afraid of the students. They don't understand that they're just people. So for me, as a teacher educator, that's one of my chief goals is really to try to spread the need of culturally relevant pedagogy equity. So I hope that helps. Makes sense.
Our audience today is mainly public school teachers, but one of our viewers asked, what about resources for homeschool parents? Are these resources that you mentioned useful to that, or any other reflections on what the homeschool community might be able to use?
Great question. As it stands, most of America, right, or a large percentage of Americans right now in the U.S. are homeschooled because of COVID-19. My wife is a teacher, as I said. She's remote. I've been remote at NKU for a little while now. My children are remote. And so there has been a shift in the United States here as it relates to COVID-19 to learning online. Every single thing that I have presented today can be accessed online. And I designed this workshop with online teachers, with homeschoolers in mind. For example, if you are teaching high school, you're a parent, you're studying the civil rights movement and John Lewis, you can access his speeches right there on YouTube. You can access the transcripts of the speeches. You can access the worksheets that I use. For the elementary, there's a YouTube clip I included from PBS on Arthur and racism that you can access right there. There's a Black Lives Matter brain pop you can use. You can create your own museum at home, your own photo museum at home. Students can do all of this research that I mentioned. I can't think of one item that cannot be done in a homeschool setting. So if you have further questions, I would be glad to talk about that. Just send me an email.
Throughout the presentation, you mentioned some books, and we'll have all of those on the website. But just as a summary, are there 3 or 4 books that you think are essential for teachers to know about?
You mean in terms of, I think I'll answer the question myself because I was going to ask, did they mean young adult literature or did they mean curriculum kind of literature? I'll just speak to both. There is a great book actually by Barack Obama called Of Thee I Sing, and it's designed for elementary, and it is a series of biographies of important African American figures in history. The work of James Banks I mentioned in terms of curriculum, multicultural education. I think that's just such an important text to understand in terms of doing this kind of work. Other books, Mildred Taylor has a series of books. Some of you folks have heard Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, but she's done other novellas. The Whale is a really good book. It deals with the African American experience in the 30s and 40s and discrimination, economic injustice. The Whale is one of them in the series. Mississippi Bridge and The Friendship. So Mildred Taylor, I use her books a lot. Virginia Hamilton. There are some recent folks that are writing. There's a whole resource, as Mark said, there's a whole resource that you can click on where I included a lot of different books. So hope that helps.
This question, some of the panelists have answered, are answering other panelists, but we appreciate your opinion, thoughts, and helping. We have a husband and wife who are both middle school science teachers, and they are looking for resources that they can bring into the middle school science class.
Wow, there's so much. Most people would, I don't want to say most people, but a lot of times when people think of integrating science and social studies, they think of inventors. And I really like that. That's one aspect I like, but we can go much deeper because I mentioned George Washington Carver. One of the things I've done when I collaborated with our science educator at NKU
we did a whole project around Katrina and the social studies aspect of Hurricane Katrina. The social studies, the science aspect of Katrina. We talked about the environmental impact. We talked about weather patterns. We talked about the levees. We talked about the economics. That's the social studies aspect of it. We talked about the racial piece, how a lot of African Americans did not get the resource that they desired. And so there's some cool ways to integrate science and social studies. The impact of disease. The pandemic is a perfect example of the intersection of really math, science, and social studies. The economic impact of COVID-19. The social studies in terms of the racial disparity, how it impacts the African American community more so than the white community. The politics of it, the numbers, looking at it from a mathematical perspective, what percentage students can look at, what percentage of the population have passed since the advent of COVID-19 in the United States in January, February 2020. What percentage is that? How does that compare to other countries? The science of it, the science of vaccine, the history of vaccine. What's the impact of vaccines on our community? Why are people afraid to take vaccines? You see, that's a great intersection. How does this relate to the Black community? Why aren't Black communities, why don't they have access to health care like white communities? What about the intersection of socioeconomics and race? So we could really say a whole lot about that. And I'm very passionate about it. I've been thinking about that particular topic a lot. What about early diseases? What about the role that Black folks played in inoculation in history? So those kinds of things.
We've had a good deal of chatter about a book, Stamped. Do you know that book and any reflections on the use of that, Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism in You?
I've heard of it. I have not read it yet, so I'm going to pass on that question. They could perhaps tell me about it.
A question, our focus today is Black history and culture, but we have a question about resources and discussions of people of color in general. If you could talk about that. Yes,
a lot of the things I talked about has to do with people of color in general, in particular, in a country that privileges Eurocentric culture. Other conversations about race in general in history, the role of Hispanics in our country. I like to study geographic history. For example, what parts of the United States used to be Mexico, and how does that impact our culture? Conversations about immigrants and the role that they play. That is so important. Our negative views of Black and brown folks, our negative views of Mexican immigrants as criminals, and some of the political rhetoric that we have been hearing for the past 4 years. These are of the utmost importance. Again, part of the blame goes to the history teachers, the social studies teachers, not the folks listening, but I mean historically, the language arts teachers, the public schools that have downplayed, they have not felt it was important to integrate Hispanic history, women's history, African American history, Native American history. I am often flabbergasted as a historian that we don't do enough about Native American history in this country. Native American history is American history. You are intellectually dishonest. I'm getting passionate now. You are intellectually dishonest if you are in a classroom and you are purposely omitting talk about Native American. Serious talk. Not that they had headdresses and they all lived in teepees, because there's diversity among Native Americans. There are different tribes and different languages, hundreds of different tribes and languages in the United States alone that are still operating today, and they're not relegated to the past. It's different if you don't know what to do, because I didn't know what to do when I first started teaching. But to intentionally omit it is intellectually dishonest. So there's so much we could say about diversity. There are some resources in the PowerPoint and in Democracy of Me about culturally relevant pedagogy. I do a lot of talks on that. So multicultural education, et cetera, and so forth. So there's a lot of the things I talked about today apply to multiple races. So.
David, you may need to repeat the question. I'm not sure if I'm being heard well.
Okay.
On the, internet land, but
Yes.
what would be your advice to administrators and school district leaders to be more inclusive?
Thank you for that question. That's a really important question. Administrators and school leaders deal with a couple of different things. They deal with budget. Oh, I was asked what my advice would be. Let me grab my water. What my advice would be to administrators and school leaders in terms of making a more diverse curriculum. I answered that question with the thought in mind that administrators are dealing with budget and then political pressure and et cetera and so forth. I would say take risk. The most important resource that we have in schools, and the reason why we're here, is for the students. Be a teacher advocate. Do not always blame the teachers. Teachers are doing the best they can. Ask teachers questions. Do professional developments that go outside of the box. Do meaningful professional developments that has to do with cultural pedagogy. Think about anti-racist kinds of conversations, because sometimes the umbrella term of diversity, in the umbrella term about diversity, the conversations about race gets lost and convoluted. And so in this country, we still need to have intentional conversations about race. So I would ask, and I'm glad I have this question, administrators to just do fact finding and focus groups about the kinds of professional developments that can be really helpful. And I know they're really, really busy, but what resources can be devoted and earmarked for real training, good conversations as it relates to multicultural education and curriculum.
Dr. Childs, when we had the student panel, it was apparent that the students have much more experience in elementary grades with Black history and culture, and less as they move through middle and high school. You teach in a college of education. Have you an idea why that would be and what might be done about it?
Yes, we have talked about that quite a bit. It seems to be at the elementary level, things are much more eclectic, and you're allowed to play. You're allowed to draw and think and sing and dance. But as we get in the upper grades, people feel that we must be more cerebral and intellectual as it relates to a rationalist perspective, as it relates to a Eurocentric way of thinking about intellectualism. And so therefore, the lecture is privileged and copious reading and taking notes is privileged. But that same energy that is put into the elementary setting can be implemented at the middle school and high school level. In fact, some of the best schools are doing integrated curriculum. Some of the tops, if you look at some of the elite programs in the country, they are doing things like the stock market simulation, where they are integrating mathematics and social studies. And integrated curriculum is what it's all about. That's one of the key things that elementary students are getting, because they get all of the 4 core subjects in that same classroom for the most part, or 1 or 2 classrooms, or 2 or 3. And so they have the opportunity to think about math and science and social studies together. And so if I'm doing a unit on Native American history, we can also talk about the environmental impacts on Native communities. So that's the science. We can look at the numbers of how many speakers of a certain language in the United States, as the Miami language, how many people still speak that? And that's social studies, science, and math. That's easier to do in social studies. And then again, the mindset. Students do a lot of artwork and creative expression and painting and singing and doing plays. For the human mind, the way we're wired, that's how we learn. And to cut that off in 5th and 6th grade is really, I've always said this is a travesty. We can do that same kind of thing. And the interesting thing is when you first introduce drawing and singing to middle grades or high school, they say this is baby stuff, but they actually want to do it. If you do it in a meaningful way, a well-planned way, they really get into it. I've had high school students doing plays and creating plays and writing songs and hip hop, and so we need to do it. I really like that question.
Sticking with the fact that you teach at a university and a college of education, we have a lot of participants today who are education majors, pre-teachers, and some faculty from our colleges of education. What has to happen in educating teachers? What
has to happen? Realizing that our world is becoming more and more diverse. Our society is becoming more and more diverse. I appreciate, question. He wanted me to repeat the question. What are key things that need to happen with our teacher candidates and our professional, our teacher educators, and I guess I would say public school teachers, the things that need to happen? We need to embrace the fact that we have a diverse society. A lot of folks are kicking and screaming that we are becoming more and more diverse, and we hear things like, by such and such year, the white race will be the minority, as if we're lamenting that, like as if that's a terrible thing. Diversity is a part of learning. We understand that we don't learn as much when we don't have a diverse perspective. I remember when I began to work with Saudi students at Northern Kentucky University, they were in my summer classes, and I had never met anybody from Saudi Arabia in a meaningful way. They were in my racism and sexism class. And there's so much I learned from them that I could not have learned from a textbook, could not have learned from a documentary. And so there is a piece of learning that we get when we are in a diverse society. And we miss out on things when we are not in a diverse society. So I understand that many people may have grown up in a rural white setting and you are not comfortable with, for example, Cincinnati public setting or Covington, et cetera, and so forth, a diverse setting, Louisville, but you will be better off. You will be uncomfortable. So what we need to learn, be intentional about studying a multicultural curriculum and ways to do it. It's a lifelong study. We're lifelong learners. Just because you don't know something, you don't have to be uncomfortable about that. Learn it. Learn how to, and nobody's asking people to apologize for being white. That's not the point here. We are all a part of the United States of America. I'm going to repeat what I said. African American history is American history. Native American history is American history. Women's history is American history. Hispanic history, Asian history, all of these are a part of the historical conversation. And when we don't get into those things, we're doing ourselves a disservice, we're doing students a disservice, we're doing society a disservice.
Dr. Johns, one last question.
Thank you.
This is a time of division and turmoil in the country. So a question about hope. If we do this better in our schools, can we expect less division? Yes. I'm seeing these seeds of unity every day. And all is not lost. We have made some progress. In some ways, we have digressed. We have regressed. That's the word I'm looking for. We have regressed. But I am hopeful. It keeps me doing this work. And I want everybody to keep pushing. This conference is hopeful. There are resources that were devoted to this conference. There are folks that pulled this together. They cared enough to invest resources. The Clark Foundation, Scripps Howard, Mark Nykerk, and the work that he does, and the school here, the Southgate School, all of these resources are devoted to this project. All of the folks that are involved in the webinar, all of you folks that signed up, that's hope. That's hope. I'm going to share this. All of the resources I have mentioned will be uploaded to the website, historyofrace.com, www.historyofrace.com. Please go there. Please write that down. My email address is childs.d1@nku.edu. You can Google me at Northern Kentucky University, Childs, CHILDS, D1@nku.edu. Would love to have conversations with you. As time permits, I can come out to schools as COVID lifts. And I just want to close out by saying, time to make that change. We are the people who can do it.
Time to make that change. We are the people that can do it. Everybody sing with me. Time to make that change. We are the people who can do it. Oh, time to make that change. We are